Abandoned in the cold snow with 3 puppies, she bowed her head, hoping for mercy. The winter morning was bitter, the kind that gnawed at bones and turned breath into icy wisps. The road stretched ahead, swallowed in mist, and the silence pressed heavy against the earth, covered in an unforgiving layer of snow. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. James Holloway, a retired mechanic turned long-haul trucker, rubbed his gloved hands together in the cab of his old Freightliner. He had driven through countless winter mornings like this, where the world felt frozen in time, waiting for something or nothing at all. The loneliness of the road was something he had learned to live with, though on mornings like these, he could almost hear his late wife's voice whispering to him. Kindness isn't about convenience, James. It's about doing what's right when no one is watching. He was already running late on his delivery, the clock on the dashboard blinking 6:14 a.m. The fog was thick, clinging to the road like a living thing. His tired eyes scanned ahead, but all he saw was white until a shadow, something barely visible on the shoulder of the road. At first, he dismissed it, probably debris, another abandoned tire or maybe an old blanket left behind by a careless traveler. But as his headlights cut through the mist, the shape became clearer. A dog. A golden retriever, her fur dull and matted, curled into herself against the cold. But it wasn't just her. Beneath her frail frame, barely visible against the snow, were 3 tiny puppies. James's grip tightened on the steering wheel. His truck rumbled past them, and for a split second, he could have kept going. He had deadlines, places to be. He wasn't some hero who rescued strays on the side of the road. But then, he caught a glimpse in his side mirror. The mother dog lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting his, filled with something raw. Not anger, not even fear. Just quiet pleading. James cursed under his breath, torn. He could already hear his dispatcher's voice in his head. Clock doesn't stop ticking just because you want to play savior, Holloway. His foot hovered over the gas pedal. Keep going. He squeezed his eyes shut, but all he saw was the image of them, shaking in the cold. The helpless rise and fall of their tiny chests. The weight of an impossible choice. With a sigh, he slammed on the brakes. The truck hissed as it came to a stop, the headlights illuminating the lonely road ahead. James grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment, pulled his coat tighter around him, and stepped into the freezing wind. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached the trembling figures. The golden retriever didn't move, didn't growl, didn't run. She just stared at him, ears flattened, watching his every step. James knelt a few feet away, keeping his movements slow. "Hey, girl," he murmured. "You got yourself in a bad spot, huh?" She let out a soft whimper but didn't retreat. Beneath her, the 3 puppies barely stirred. His throat tightened. "You've been out here too long." The mother dog shivered violently but didn't take her eyes off him. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Let's get you out of here." He unzipped his thick winter jacket and carefully scooped up the 3 puppies, tucking them close to his chest for warmth. They barely reacted, too cold, too weak to protest. But the mother still didn't move. "Come on, girl," James coaxed, stepping back toward the truck. "I'm not leaving without you." She hesitated, her body wavering with exhaustion. Then, as if deciding to trust this stranger, she pushed herself up on shaky legs and followed. The cab was warm when James climbed back in, setting the puppies on the passenger seat and reaching for an old blanket from behind his seat. The mother dog leapt up, curling protectively around her pups, her tired eyes never leaving his face. James ran a hand through his graying hair, shaking his head with a wry smile. "Guess I've got some explaining to do when I get to Portland." The truck rumbled back onto the highway, carrying its unexpected passengers toward a future they never expected. James didn't know what would happen next. But as the golden retriever sighed softly beside him, closing her eyes for the first time in what was probably days, he realized something. Maybe kindness wasn't about convenience. Maybe it was about saving someone when they needed it most, even if that someone had 4 legs and a heart full of trust. The morning air was bitterly cold, the kind that turned breath into ice and gnawed at exposed skin. Snow draped the landscape like a frozen shroud, and the road stretched into the fog, empty and silent. James Holloway, a seasoned trucker, gripped the steering wheel of his old Freightliner, his thoughts lost in the monotony of the highway. He was a man who had long learned to ignore the loneliness that came with life on the road. But on mornings like these, when the world was still and quiet, sometimes, angels appear in the most unexpected places. He exhaled, shaking the thought away. Then he saw it. A shape on the side of the road, barely discernible against the snowy backdrop. At first, James dismissed it as a discarded bag or pile of snow-covered debris. But as his headlights swept over it, the silhouette became clear: a dog, curled into herself, shielding something beneath her. His stomach twisted as he realized what he was seeing. Puppies. 3 tiny, frail bodies huddled beneath the trembling mother, barely moving in the cold. James gritted his teeth, his hands tightening on the wheel. "It's not my problem," he told himself. He had deadlines to meet. He could already hear his dispatcher's voice in his head. "You're late again, Holloway. Clock doesn't stop just because you want to play hero." He drove past them. But then, as he glanced in his side mirror, he saw her lift her head. Her deep brown eyes met his for the briefest moment. Not with anger. Not even with fear. Just quiet, desperate pleading. James swore under his breath and slammed on the brakes. The truck groaned as it came to a halt. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and threw open the door. The cold hit him like a hammer, seeping through his jacket instantly. Snow crunched under his boots as he trudged toward the figures in the snow. The mother dog didn't move as he approached, her body so exhausted that even lifting her head seemed like a monumental effort. Her fur, once golden and thick, was now damp, matted with frost. Her ribs showed beneath her coat, and her breath was labored. James knelt in the snow. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't growl. She didn't flinch. She just watched him, her body trembling violently. The puppies, no larger than his gloved hands, barely stirred, their tiny chests rising and falling in slow, weak motions. His throat tightened. "You're not going to make it out here," he whispered. "None of you will." For a moment, doubt gnawed at him. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't just load a stray dog and her puppies into his truck. His cab wasn't a kennel. And even if he did, what then? He wasn't a vet. He wasn't a hero. But Catherine's voice echoed again. Sometimes, angels appear in the most unexpected places. James exhaled sharply. The decision was made. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get you out of here." He shrugged off his heavy coat, spreading it on the snow. Carefully, he picked up the first puppy, a fragile little thing that barely filled his hands, and placed it on the coat. The mother let out a weak whimper of protest, but James met her eyes. "I know," he said softly. "I know you don't trust me yet, but I'm not leaving you." One by one, he gathered the puppies, wrapping them in the coat to shield them from the cold. Finally, he turned to the mother. She was watching him, her body shaking from the effort of staying upright. "Come on, girl," James said, patting his leg. She hesitated. "Please," he whispered. "I can't do this without you." As if she understood, she staggered to her feet. Swaying slightly, she took one uncertain step, then another. James led her carefully toward the truck, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Once at the cab, he lifted the puppies inside, placing the coat gently on the passenger seat. Then he turned to the mother. "Up you go," he murmured, grunting slightly as he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, far too light. Malnourished, weak. Inside, she curled protectively around her pups. The warmth from the truck's heater slowly seeped into her frozen limbs. James sat behind the wheel, slamming the door against the cold. He turned to her, watching as she let out a deep, exhausted sigh. "You need a name," he murmured, tapping his fingers on the dashboard. He thought for a moment before offering a small smile. "Lucy," he decided. "I'll call you Lucy." The mother dog blinked slowly, her tired eyes softening, as if she understood. James shook his head, shifting into gear. "Well, Lucy," he said with a smirk, "looks like you just messed up my schedule." The truck rumbled back onto the highway. He didn't know what would happen next. But as Lucy rested her head against her tiny, breathing pups and the fog began to lift on the road ahead, James realized something. Maybe kindness wasn't about convenience. Maybe it was about saving someone when they needed it most, even if that someone had 4 legs and a heart full of trust. The warm air inside the gas station was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The small building smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil, familiar and comforting in a way only small-town places could be. But James Holloway barely noticed as he carefully set Lucy down on the blanket Sarah had spread out on the floor. The German Shepherd mother dog was weak, her ribs visible beneath her frost-covered coat. Her 3 puppies, still bundled in James's heavy coat, trembled as Sarah gently laid them beside her. Mike Brown, the station's resident mechanic, crouched down beside them, his scowl deepening. Jesus, poor things. He ran a rough but surprisingly gentle hand over Lucy's fur, feeling the sharpness of her bones. How long do you think she's been out there? Too long, James muttered, rubbing a hand over his beard. The tightness in his chest wouldn't leave. Sarah, still kneeling beside Lucy, suddenly frowned. Wait a second. She brushed back the fur on the mother dog's neck, her fingers stopping at something beneath the damp, matted coat. What's this? James straightened. What? Sarah held up the worn leather collar Lucy was wearing. Near the buckle, a small faded mark was barely visible. It looked like some kind of logo, something circular, with letters that had almost disappeared under layers of grime. Mike squinted at it. That's not a stray's collar, he said, voice gruff. Someone owned her. James felt his stomach drop. Then why the hell was she out there freezing to death? Sarah hesitated, glancing at the puppies and then at Lucy, who blinked tiredly at her. You're not gonna like this, James. Try me. This isn't the first time. James frowned. What do you mean? Sarah exhaled. Last week, someone found 2 golden retrievers abandoned near the old bridge south of here. Same condition, starving, weak. And the week before that, near Route 22, a litter of mixed-breed puppies left out in the cold. A cold dread settled in James's gut. You think someone's dumping these dogs? Sarah nodded grimly. Mike swore under his breath. His hands balled into fists. People like that ought to be locked up. James clenched his jaw, his mind racing. This doesn't sit right. If it was just one dog, maybe, but this feels like someone's getting rid of them. The room fell silent, except for the soft whimper of one of the puppies. Then, the faint rumble of an engine outside made them all freeze. Sarah's head snapped toward the window. Did you hear that? James pushed away from the wall and stepped closer to the glass. Outside, through the thinning fog, a sleek black car idled near the gas pumps. Its dark-tinted windows reflected the gray morning light, making it impossible to see inside. The car sat there for a long moment, the engine humming softly, almost watching them. Mike scowled. Who the hell is that? The car lingered for a few more seconds before suddenly accelerating, its tires crunching against the gravel as it sped off down the road. James's stomach twisted. You know them? He asked, his voice tight. Sarah shook her head. Never seen that car before. Yeah, but it's not the first time I've seen one like it, Mike muttered. His usual gruff voice was lower now, almost wary. There's been a black car hanging around near my shop a couple of times this week. Thought it was some lost traveler. James exchanged a glance with Sarah. This is connected, she said firmly. I don't believe in coincidences. Neither did James. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the old radio playing softly in the background and the quiet breathing of the exhausted German Shepherd beside them. Then, finally, James exhaled. What now? He asked. Sarah squared her shoulders. First, we get Lucy and these pups to the vet. If there's something going on, we're not letting them be another statistic. James nodded. He reached down, gently brushing his fingers over Lucy's head. She looked up at him with those same deep brown eyes, the same ones that had stopped him on the road, that had pleaded for help in the freezing dawn. She'd been waiting for mercy. And now, someone was going to pay for what had been done to her. James Holloway didn't hesitate as he pulled out his wallet, his fingers tightening around the crisp bills inside. His emergency fund meant for truck repairs. Maybe a rainy day was now a lifeline for a tiny life hanging by a thread. "I'll cover it," James said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Do whatever it takes." Dr. Anderson gave him a long, knowing look, then nodded. "All right, let's get to work." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing," she whispered. James swallowed hard and stepped back, watching as Dr. Anderson and his assistant moved swiftly. The clinic suddenly buzzed with urgency. IV lines were prepared, fluids warmed, and oxygen set up. The smallest puppy, now named Ben, lay motionless as the vet carefully inserted a tiny catheter into his frail leg. Lucy, the German Shepherd mother, let out a soft whimper from her spot on the floor. She wanted to help but was too weak to move. James crouched beside her, running a gentle hand down her spine. "He's in good hands, girl," James murmured, but he wasn't sure if the words were for her or himself. A dangerous truth. Minutes turned into an hour. The tension in the room thickened with each beep of the vital monitors. James forced himself to breathe, his mind still replaying the ominous words he'd overheard weeks ago, the conversation between two men at the diner about faulty stock and getting rid of what doesn't sell. Was it possible that this wasn't just about strays? Sarah had said this wasn't the first case. What if someone was breeding dogs and dumping the weak ones? The thought made James's stomach turn. The sleek black car from earlier flashed in his mind. Was it just coincidence? Or had they been watching? He exhaled sharply. He wasn't the kind of man to chase conspiracies, but his gut told him this wasn't over. The fight for Ben. Dr. Anderson stepped back from the table, pulling off his gloves. "He's stable," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. "For now." James exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "But," the vet continued, "the next 24 hours are critical. If he makes it through the night, his chances go up. If not, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to." James clenched his jaw and nodded. "You can leave him here," Dr. Anderson offered. "We'll monitor him closely." James shook his head. Everyone turned toward him in surprise. "I'll stay," James said firmly. "If something happens, I want to be here." Sarah smiled softly. "I'll stay too." Lucy let out a soft sigh, as if she understood she wasn't alone anymore. A reckoning approaches. As night fell, James sat beside Lucy on the floor, watching Ben's tiny chest rise and fall under the warming light. His mind swirled with thoughts. Someone had dumped these dogs, knowing they wouldn't survive. And if it was part of something bigger, some backwoods breeder cutting losses, James wasn't going to just let it go. If there was one thing he'd learned from life on the road, it was that you don't turn your back on something once you've decided to care. He had a long haul ahead of him. But now, it wasn't just about deliveries and truck routes. Now, it was about justice. And James Holloway wasn't about to let this go unanswered. James Holloway sat in the small-town gas station, staring into his third cup of coffee. The steam curled in lazy tendrils, but the warmth didn't reach him. Outside, his red Peterbilt truck idled, sending soft puffs of smoke into the frigid morning air. Inside, Lucy lay curled at his feet, her golden fur finally clean, though she was still too thin, still too exhausted. The three healthier puppies lay nestled in an old blanket-lined box nearby, their tiny bodies rising and falling in peaceful sleep. But the fourth Ben was still at Dr. Anderson's clinic, fighting for his life. James couldn't shake the unease gnawing at his gut. The black car. The discarded dogs. The overheard conversation at the diner. It all felt connected, though he couldn't yet see how. Across the counter, Sarah Parker's voice broke the morning silence. She was on the phone, speaking quickly, her expression shifting from concern to something sharper. "When? Where exactly?" she asked, gripping the receiver. She glanced at James, her green eyes flashing with something between urgency and anger. James set his coffee down. "What's going on?" Sarah hung up and exhaled. "That was Mike," she said, lowering her voice. "He's been hearing things. There's been another dumping." James sat up straighter. "Where?" "Off Route 22. Same as before. His blood ran cold. Another litter. Another mother. Another death sentence. He pushed back from the table. I need to go. Sarah grabbed his wrist before he could stand. James, wait. You can't just... I have to, he cut in, his voice firm but not unkind. He shook his head. Whoever's doing this isn't stopping. And I won't sit around drinking coffee while another dog freezes to death. Sarah sighed but nodded, reaching under the counter. Take this. She handed him a heavy flashlight. In case you need it. A chilling discovery. James drove fast. The truck roared down the icy back roads, his grip tight on the wheel. The sun had barely risen, casting long, skeletal shadows over the frost-covered trees. When he reached the location, he spotted tire tracks leading off the main road, disappearing into the snow-covered woods. He parked, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out, the bitter wind biting at his skin. His boots crunched through the frozen ground as he followed the tracks. The forest was silent, too silent. Then he saw it. A patch of disturbed snow, and in the center, a dog. She was lying on her side, barely moving, her fur coated in frost. James swallowed the lump in his throat and approached carefully. Hey girl, he murmured, kneeling beside her. She was a German shepherd like Lucy, her coat a mix of tan and black, though dulled by starvation and exposure. Her ribs were stark against her thin frame. Then, a faint sound, a whimper. James turned his flashlight and his heart clenched. Puppies. 3 tiny figures huddled against their mother, their fur barely visible beneath the snow. Their little bodies trembled with weak, shallow breaths. James didn't hesitate. He shed his coat and wrapped the puppies inside, pulling them close to his chest. Hang in there, he whispered. The mother's eyes flickered open, glazed but desperate. She lifted her head weakly and bowed it toward him as if she knew this was her only chance, as if she was surrendering her babies into his hands, pleading for their lives. James clenched his jaw against the emotion rising in his throat. I've got them, he promised. And I've got you too. With a careful but firm grip, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward the truck. An unseen threat. As he reached his truck and settled the mother and her pups inside, something pricked at his instincts, a feeling that he wasn't alone. He glanced around, scanning the trees. The stillness felt unnatural. Then, in the distance, headlights. A car, partially hidden behind the trees, engine running. James narrowed his eyes. The black car. It didn't move, didn't approach, just watched. A slow anger burned in James's chest. So, they were still around, watching, waiting. He turned away, climbed into his truck, and slammed the door shut. Whoever they were, they wouldn't get these dogs. Not today. As he pulled back onto the road, he reached for his phone. Sarah, call the sheriff, he said. You found them? She asked. Yeah, James said, his voice like steel. And I think I found something else too. The road ahead. By the time James reached Dr. Anderson's clinic, Ben was still fighting. The news was hopeful, his condition was improving. And now, another mother and her 3 pups had a chance too. James watched Lucy from across the room as she curled protectively around her remaining pups. She lifted her head and met his gaze, those deep, soulful eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, trust, understanding. He exhaled. He wasn't done yet. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to get away with it. James Holloway had spent his life on the road, moving forward, never looking back. But this time, he wasn't driving away. This time, he was staying. This time, he was fighting. The roadside was eerily quiet when James Holloway parked his truck in the exact spot where he had found Lucy and her puppy. Snow had fallen again overnight, covering the ground in a fresh white layer, but faint signs of disturbance remained ghostly reminders of what had been left behind. James climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching against the ice. Beside him, Mike Brown pulled his coat tighter against the wind. The sun had risen higher now, though it did little to cut the chill or the creeping unease that settled in James's gut. You really think there's something here? Mike asked, surveying the quiet stretch of highway. James exhaled, scanning the tree line. I don't know, but I have to check." They moved carefully along the roadside, following where the snow had been disturbed before. James's breath was steady, but his pulse pounded in his ears. If Golden Paws had dumped Lucy and her litter here, what else had they left behind? A few yards from where James had first spotted Lucy, something caught his eye, a patch of disturbed snow leading toward the trees. He pointed. There, something was dragged. Mike followed his gaze. "Looks fresh." James crouched, running his gloved fingers over the compressed snow. It wasn't a small trail. Whatever had been moved had weight to it. He followed the tracks into the woods, his heart hammering. The trees closed in, muffling the wind. Then he saw it. A second collar, half buried in the snow. James's stomach turned. He dug it out, brushing off the frost. Unlike Lucy's, this one had been cut, as if someone had removed it in a hurry. Mike cursed under his breath. Somebody didn't want this dog to be identified. James turned the collar over, his fingers tracing the same faded mark near the buckle, the same insignia found on Lucy's. Golden Paws. A cold wave of realization swept through him. How many dogs had been left out here to die? Then, from the distance, a sound. A whimper. James froze. His eyes locked onto the dense brush ahead. He exchanged a quick glance with Mike before pushing forward, his pulse racing. The whimper came again, weak, barely audible over the rustling branches. Then, James saw her. Another dog. She was curled up beneath the trees, a skeletal frame shivering in the snow. Her coat, a mix of black and tan, was dull with malnourishment. And beside her, 2 more puppies. A grim reality. James's throat tightened. The mother dog lifted her head weakly as he approached, her deep brown eyes full of exhaustion and recognition. Lucy's eyes. James knelt, his hands steady despite the storm of anger and grief inside him. "Hey, girl," he murmured. "I got you." The dog didn't move. She was too weak. Her ribs were sharp beneath her fur, her breaths shallow. James shrugged off his coat and carefully bundled the puppies first, their tiny bodies trembling against his warmth. Then he turned to the mother. "Come on, sweetheart," he coaxed. "We're not leaving you here." Mike stepped in, helping to lift the frail dog. She didn't resist. They hurried back to the truck, James barely registering the icy wind biting at his skin. His only thought was getting them to safety. As they settled the dogs into the warm cab, Mike let out a slow breath. "This isn't just about a few abandoned animals, is it?" James clenched his jaw, his hands still shaking. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." Golden Paws hadn't just left Lucy and her litter to die. They'd been doing this over and over, and someone was still watching. Nowhere to hide. Back at Anderson Veterinary Clinic, James carried the mother dog inside, his grip gentle but firm. Dr. Anderson looked up from his charts, surprise flashing across his face. "Another one?" James nodded. "And 2 more pups." Sarah, who had rushed over after James's call, gasped. "Oh my God." Dr. Anderson immediately set to work, examining the new arrivals. The puppies were weak but stable. The mother, however, was worse off than Lucy, had been dehydrated, barely clinging to consciousness. James stood by as the vet placed her on IV fluids. His fists clenched as he watched her tiny chest rise and fall with slow, labored breaths. Mike, standing beside him, crossed his arms. "This is bigger than we thought." James nodded. His mind raced through everything he had seen. The abandoned dogs. The black car. The fact that someone was watching. Then, as if on cue, the headlights appeared. From the clinic window, James saw the same black car. Parked across the street. Engine running. Waiting. James's pulse thundered. Sarah followed his gaze and went pale. "It's them." Mike's face darkened. "They're making sure we don't ask too many questions." James took a slow breath, steadying himself. Then he turned to Sarah. "Call the sheriff." Sarah hesitated. "You think that'll stop them?" James's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not letting them take another dog." A long silence stretched between them before Sarah nodded and reached for the phone. Outside, the black car lingered a moment longer before, just like before, it peeled away, disappearing into the cold morning light. But James knew. They weren't gone. They were waiting. And James Holloway was done waiting. This wasn't just about saving dogs anymore. It was about stopping the people trying to bury them. The black car cut sharply in front of James Holloway's truck, forcing him to slam on the brakes. The Peterbilt groaned in protest as it skidded slightly, its weight settling on the icy road. The man who stepped out was tall, dressed in a black overcoat, and despite the cold, wore dark sunglasses. Too clean. Too calculated. Mike cursed under his breath. "This ain't good, James." James clenched his jaw, gripping the wheel tightly as the man approached. Every instinct in his body screamed danger. He reached for the gear shift, ready to reverse if needed. The man stopped a few feet away from the truck, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled. "Mr. Holloway," the man said smoothly. "You've been busy." James didn't answer. He could feel Lucy shifting in the cab behind him, the mother dog sensing the tension. "You picked up something that doesn't belong to you," the man continued, his voice calm but with a weight that carried a threat. "I believe you have something of ours." James's mind raced. The tag. They knew. He kept his voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man chuckled. "Come on now, Mr. Holloway. Let's not play games. We both know those dogs shouldn't have been found." Mike stiffened beside him. "Shouldn't have been found?" he echoed, his voice laced with disgust. "You left them out there to die." The man tilted his head slightly. "Unfortunate, yes. But not your concern." His smile faded. "You're a smart man, Mr. Holloway. Walk away. Hand over the tag. Forget this ever happened." James stared at him. The anger simmering in his gut turned into something sharper. This wasn't just about Lucy and her puppies. It was bigger. "How many others?" James asked, his voice dangerously low. The man sighed as if disappointed. "More than you can save." James's grip on the wheel tightened. He had a choice to make. He could hand over the tag, pretend he never saw any of this, and go back to his life. Or he could see this through. He glanced at Mike. His old friend gave a barely perceptible nod. James reached into his jacket pocket, pretending to pull out the tag. Instead, he gunned the engine. The Peterbilt roared to life, the tires screeching against the ice. The black-coated man barely had time to react before James jerked the wheel, sending the truck lurching forward. The man jumped back as James swerved around the black car and shot down the highway. Mike whooped. "That's what I'm talking about." James's hands were steady on the wheel, his heart pounding. "They're not getting that tag." A race against time. The black car spun around in the rearview mirror and peeled after them. "They're following," Mike warned. James kept his eyes ahead. The town wasn't far. If they could just make it. A sudden jolt shook the truck as the black car slammed into their rear bumper. Lucy whimpered in the cab. The puppies stirred in their crate. James cursed. "They're trying to run us off the road." Mike grabbed onto the dashboard as the car rammed them again. "James, do something before we end up in a ditch." The road curved sharply ahead. If James miscalculated, the truck would flip. He waited just another second, then jerked the wheel hard, forcing the truck to the right before swinging back left. The sudden maneuver sent the black car skidding wildly. It spun out, tires screeching, before crashing into a snowbank. Mike twisted in his seat. "Hell, yeah? That'll slow him down." James didn't let up. He pushed the truck to its limits, engine roaring as they sped toward town. They reached the outskirts just as blue and red lights flashed ahead. James had never been so relieved to see the sheriff's office. No more running. Sheriff Tom Ridley was already stepping out of his patrol car as James pulled into the station's lot. A burly man with graying hair and a permanent frown, Ridley had been in law enforcement longer than most people had been alive. James barely put the truck in park before jumping out, Lucy barking behind him. "Sheriff," James said urgently, holding up the metal tag. "You need to see this." Ridley took it, his sharp eyes scanning the words. When he looked back up, his expression was grim. "Where'd you get this?" James exhaled. Lucy's collar. I found her and her pups abandoned in the snow 2 nights ago, and I just had a run-in with some guys who didn't want me bringing this to you. Ridley's frown deepened. Damn. Mike stepped forward. Sheriff, this isn't just about some abandoned dogs. They're running something big. And I bet if you start digging, you'll find out they never really shut Golden Paws down. Ridley sighed, rubbing his jaw. I don't like this. He glanced at Lucy, who sat faithfully by James's side. But I don't like leaving folks like you hanging either. He motioned toward the station. Let's talk. A fight worth taking. Inside the sheriff's office, James laid everything out from the puppies to the black car to the threats. Ridley listened in silence, then leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. If this is what I think it is, we're going to need more than just a local investigation. James met his gaze. Then bring in whoever you need. Ridley studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Lucy let out a small sigh, resting her head against James's leg. James reached down, running a hand through her fur. He had never expected any of this when he first stopped on the side of the road. But he didn't regret it. He looked at Lucy's tired but trusting eyes. Sometimes angels appear in the most unexpected places. Maybe Catherine had been right all along. But James wasn't stopping here. Not until every last one of those monsters paid for what they had done. Snow fell in soft, whispering sheets as James Holloway climbed into his truck, the cold air thick with the weight of what had just happened. The warning from the man in the black coat still lingered, heavy in his mind. He wasn't scared, he was furious. Someone had dumped Lucy and her puppies to die, and now the people responsible wanted him to forget. That wasn't going to happen. Mike exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together for warmth. You really think Roberts will be able to do anything? James stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel. He has to. Lucy, curled up on the seat beside him, lifted her head, her soft brown eyes meeting his. She had been given a second chance. Now, it was up to James to make sure the ones responsible never did this again. The investigation begins. The next morning, James was woken by the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He groggily reached for it, his muscles stiff from the restless night. The name on the screen read Detective Roberts. James sat up quickly. Yeah? Roberts' voice was tight. I ran the number you gave me. It's a burner, untraceable. But I did some digging on Golden Paws. Turns out, they were shut down last year officially. James frowned. And unofficially? Roberts sighed. Unofficially, dogs matching Lucy's description, same breed, same condition, have been turning up abandoned in different parts of the state. Somebody's still operating. James clenched his jaw. So we need to find them before more dogs get left to die. That's easier said than done, Roberts said. Golden Paws was funded by private investors, people with money and power. If they think you're a problem, they'll try to make you disappear. James' grip tightened on the phone. Let them try. A dangerous lead. Later that day, James and Mike drove back to the gas station where Sarah had first contacted the rescue group. When they walked in, Sarah was already waiting, her face set in grim determination. I got a call this morning, she said, sliding a piece of paper across the counter. One of the other rescuers found another dog, same breed, same condition, dumped on an old farm road about 20 miles from here. James picked up the paper. Someone's still cleaning up their mess. Mike folded his arms. We go check it out? Sarah hesitated. James, if you go poking around too much, they'll know. James nodded. Good. Let them know. Back to the scene of the crime. The road stretched ahead of them, winding through empty farmland covered in snow. The directions led them to an abandoned barn, its wooden beams sagging under years of neglect. The moment James stepped out of the truck, he knew something was off. The air was too still. The snow, too undisturbed. It was quiet, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind of quiet that came before a storm. Mike walked ahead, peering into the barn. James, you better see this. Inside, the ground was covered in paw prints. A rusted metal chain lay discarded in the dirt, still attached to a broken collar. Blood speckled the snow. James' stomach twisted. Whoever was here, They left in a hurry. Mike cursed under his breath. Maybe someone found the dog before we did? James wasn't so sure. He took another step inside when a noise. A rustle from the back of the barn. James froze. Did you hear that? Mike nodded slowly. Yeah, and I don't like it. James reached for the flashlight tucked into his jacket and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on a pair of frightened amber eyes staring back at them. Another survivor. A German shepherd, thin, covered in mud and snow, cowered in the corner. Its ribs were visible through its matted fur, and a broken chain dangled from its collar. James knelt, extending a hand. Easy there, boy. The dog flinched but didn't growl. He was too weak to fight, too tired to run. Mike exhaled. Someone left him here to die. James reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of jerky from his truck stash. Come on, buddy. Let's get you out of here. The shepherd hesitated. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, it took a step forward. That was all James needed. No more running. They loaded the dog into the truck, wrapping him in a spare blanket as they drove back toward town. Mike shook his head. This isn't just about bad breeding, is it? James exhaled, watching the road ahead. No, it's about money. And people willing to kill for it. Mike frowned. So what do we do? James glanced in the rearview mirror at the shepherd curled up next to Lucy and her puppies. We don't stop. The final stand. That night, James sat at his kitchen table, Lucy asleep at his feet, the shepherd resting nearby. His mind raced. He was being watched, threatened, warned to stay away. But he wasn't backing down. His phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. Walk away. You don't know what you're getting into. James stared at the screen for a long moment before typing his reply. James Holloway. Neither do you. He set the phone down, his decision made. The people behind Golden Paws had tried to erase their mistakes. But now, James was going to make sure the whole world saw them. They had come after Lucy, after her puppies, after an innocent dog left to freeze in an abandoned barn. Now, it was James they needed to be afraid of. The soft glow of the fire flickered against the wooden walls of James Holloway's home. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. The gentle breaths of Lucy and her 3 puppies filled the quiet space, blending with the occasional crackling of the fire. In his arms, Ben, small, fragile, but miraculously alive, nestled into his chest, his tiny body warm against the thick fabric of James' coat. James exhaled, running a rough hand over Ben's fur. Just days ago, this little one had been on the verge of death, lungs weak, body freezing. And now he had a chance. Outside, the world was still covered in white, a stark contrast to the warmth now filling James' chest. He'd spent so long on the road, moving from one place to another, chasing miles and memories, that he had forgotten what home even felt like. But maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a rescue mission. Maybe it was something more. The fallout from Golden Paws. The next morning, James sat at the small table in his kitchen, sipping his coffee as the old radio on the counter crackled to life. Authorities have confirmed that Golden Paws Labs was part of a larger underground breeding operation that spanned multiple states. Investigators believe that dozens of dogs were abandoned in rural areas, left to die in the cold after failing to meet genetic requirements set by the facility. Several high-profile arrests have been made, though officials believe more individuals connected to the operation remain at large. Authorities urge citizens to report any abandoned dogs matching the description. James turned the radio off. They had done it. Lucy let out a soft huff from her spot near the fireplace, lifting her head slightly at the sound. James glanced at her, offering a reassuring nod. "It's over," he muttered. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Not really. A warning that wouldn't be ignored. Later that day, James drove into town, stopping at Pine Tree Station to check in with Sarah and Mike. As he pulled into the lot, a chill ran down his spine. The black car. It was there again. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenching. They weren't done watching him. Stepping out of the truck, He made his way inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Sarah looked up from behind the counter, her face etched with concern. "James, did you hear the news?" "I did," he muttered. "Seems like the right people are finally paying for what they did." Mike, who was leaning against the counter with grease-stained hands, let out a scoff. "Yeah, well, I don't think they're too happy about it." Sarah swallowed hard. "That car, James, it was parked across from my place last night, too. I didn't say anything before, but I don't think they're done with this." James nodded slowly, his gut tightening. "I saw it outside just now." Mike straightened. "They're not even trying to hide anymore." James wasn't surprised. He'd exposed something bigger than he realized, and whoever was left pulling the strings wanted him to know it. "They can watch all they want," James said, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down." Sarah's expression darkened. "James, I think you should be careful. If these people were willing to let dogs die, you think they'd hesitate to go after you?" James exhaled sharply. Let them try. A home no longer empty. That night, as James sat on his porch, a shotgun resting against the wooden railing beside him, he watched. The black car was gone, but the unease in his gut remained. Inside, Lucy and the puppies were fast asleep, their small bodies curled up together near the fire. They were safe now. James had spent years convincing himself that the road was where he belonged. That settling down meant giving up. But as he glanced through the window, watching Lucy stretch lazily in the warmth of his home, he realized something. This wasn't just about saving them. They had saved him too. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, James Holloway had a reason to stay. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of summer. For the first time in years, James Holloway didn't feel like a man living in the past. He sat on his porch, his old rocking chair creaking beneath him, sipping his coffee as he watched the golden light of the sunset stretch across his land. Lucy lay beside him, her golden fur glistening in the fading daylight. She no longer looked like the weak, half-frozen dog he'd found in the snow. She was strong now, her body filled out from weeks of good meals and warm shelter. And most importantly, she was home. In the yard, her 3 puppies tumbled and rolled through the grass, their playful yips filling the air. Ben, the smallest and once the weakest, was leading the chase. He darted between his siblings with surprising speed, his tiny tail wagging as if every step was a victory over the battle he'd fought to survive. Mike leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed over his chest, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You know," he said, shaking his head, "if someone had told me a few months ago that James Holloway, the toughest old trucker in town, would turn into a full-time dog dad, I'd have laughed in their face." James chuckled, setting his mug down on the armrest. "Yeah, well, life's got a funny way of surprising you." Sarah, kneeling in the grass, tossed a small rubber ball for the pups. "You sure about keeping them all, James?" she teased. "You could always let me take one off your hands." James shot her a look, his lips twitching with amusement. "Not a chance. They stay with their mom." Sarah grinned. Figured as much. The house behind them, once cold and silent, was now filled with life. Toys were scattered across the floor, a dog bed sat in the corner, and the scent of warm fur and fresh kibble had replaced the emptiness that once lingered there. James Holloway had spent years convincing himself that he was meant to be alone. That losing Catherine meant losing everything. But sitting here now, with Lucy resting at his feet and Ben curled up beside her, he knew the truth. This was where he was meant to be. A past that wouldn't stay buried. As the sky darkened, James' thoughts drifted back to Golden Paws. The investigation had taken down the worst of them, but James knew better than to believe it was truly over. Somewhere out there, the people responsible for dumping Lucy and her pups were still watching. The black car had disappeared for now. But James wasn't naive. He had spent enough time on the road to know when trouble was lying in wait. "They're not done with this," Mike murmured, as if reading his mind. "You know that, right?" James nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know." Sarah sighed, brushing dirt off her hands as she stood. "Well, if they come back, they're going to have to deal with more than just you. This whole town knows what you did, James, and we're not about to let those bastards get away with it." A sense of quiet resolve settled over them. They weren't just protecting a few dogs anymore. They were making sure no one else suffered like Lucy and her pups had. James glanced down at Ben, now fast asleep in the grass, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Some battles were worth fighting, and James Holloway wasn't done fighting yet. The night had settled in, wrapping the world in a hush only winter could bring. James Holloway sat on his porch, rocking slowly, a warm cup of coffee cradled in his hands. Inside, Lucy and her puppies lay curled together in their bed, safe and warm. The once shivering mother, who had been nothing but skin and bones when he found her in the snow, was now strong and whole. Her watchful eyes no longer held fear, only trust. Mike stood at the railing, staring out over the darkened yard, his breath curling in the cold air. "You ever think," he asked, voice thoughtful, "that all of this happened for a reason?" James glanced over, brow furrowing slightly. Mike shrugged, his rough voice softer than usual. "I mean, you could have kept driving that day. Most people would have, but you stopped. Maybe something wanted you to." James didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the yard, where the puppies were nestled in the grass earlier, where Lucy had sat watching over them like the guardian she was. His heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. "Catherine used to say that God puts angels in our path when we least expect them," James said finally, his voice low. "I used to think she was just being poetic, but now—" He gestured toward the house. "Now, I think she was right." Sarah, who had been sitting quietly on the steps, smiled, her eyes glistening. "Maybe this was always meant to happen, James. Maybe this family was waiting for you." James let out a slow breath. "No," he murmured. "I think we were waiting for each other. A home no longer empty." Later that night, after Mike and Sarah had gone, James remained on the porch alone. Inside, the house was filled with the soft sounds of sleeping dogs. The warmth of the fireplace cast golden light onto the walls, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness it once held. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the sky. The stars shone brighter tonight, as if they too had been waiting for this moment. He thought of Catherine, of the way she used to fill this home with her laughter, her warmth. "I hope you're smiling," he murmured to the heavens. "You were right all along." A faint breeze whispered past him, stirring the leaves. Whether it was simply the wind or something more, he didn't know. But for the first time in years, he felt at peace. James had made choices in his life, some easy, some hard. But this, stopping for Lucy and her pups, that had been the choice that mattered most. Because sometimes, when you least expect it, angels don't have wings. Sometimes they have paws. A second chance for all of them. James never saw himself as a man in need of saving. He had lived his life 1 mile at a time, believing that the best days were behind him. But Lucy, Ben, and the others had proved something he never expected. Life always has more to give, if you have the heart to accept it. And so, as he sat there, listening to the soft sounds of home, he clasped his hands together, bowing his head in quiet gratitude. "Thank you for guiding me, for showing me this path, and for bringing them home." When he opened his eyes, the house behind him glowed warmly, no longer empty. James let out a quiet chuckle as Ben let out a tiny bark in his sleep. He reached down, giving Lucy a gentle pat. She sighed, content, pressing against his leg. The story of Lucy and her puppies wasn't just about saving lives. It was about hope, redemption, faith. It was proof that even in the darkest moments, light can find a way in if you're willing to see it. For those who had followed his story, for those who had ever been blessed by the love of an animal, for those who had ever experienced a second chance, James Holloway's story was a simple reminder. Sometimes, angels appear in the most unexpected places. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find one of your own. The power of compassion, a lesson from James Holloway's story. In today's fast-paced world, where people rush through their lives consumed by deadlines, responsibilities, and personal struggles, it's easy to overlook the small, silent cries for help that surround us. James Holloway's story is a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in life come when we choose to stop. Much like James on that icy road, we all encounter situations where we have a choice to look away or to act. These moments aren't always as dramatic as finding a mother dog and her puppies abandoned in the snow. Sometimes, it's as simple as noticing a struggling neighbor, a friend who seems distant, or even a stranger in need. The question is, do we keep driving or do we stop? The world today can feel disconnected. Technology allows us to communicate instantly, yet genuine human connection often feels like it's slipping away. We scroll past heartbreaking news stories, witness injustices, and hear about suffering, but too often we assume someone else will step in. The reality? Sometimes there is no one else. Sometimes we are the only ones who see the problem, and that makes it our moment to choose. James didn't stop because he had a grand plan to change the world. He stopped because he listened to his heart. He saw a helpless creature in the snow and acted not because it was easy, not because it was convenient, but because it was the right thing to do. In doing so, he not only saved Lucy and her puppies, but he also saved himself. How often do we hesitate to help because we tell ourselves, "I'm too busy. It's not my problem. Someone else will do something"? But what if, like James, that act of kindness is exactly what changes our path? What if, in saving someone else, we find a deeper purpose in our own lives? This story is about far more than a man and a dog. It's about the ripple effect of compassion. One small decision to stop set off a chain reaction that brought down a cruel operation, reunited a family, and gave James a second chance at life. That's the power of empathy. It has the ability to transform, to heal, and to rebuild what was once broken. The truth is, we all have our Lucy moments, those times when we see suffering and feel the tug to do something. The question is, will we listen? Will we take that step, knowing it might inconvenience us, knowing we might not have all the answers? Because in the end, compassion is never about convenience. It's about courage. James Holloway's story is proof that kindness isn't just about changing the world for others. It's about changing ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, the angels we're meant to save are the ones that save us in return. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that capture the deep and powerful connection between humans and animals. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Together, let's celebrate the extraordinary bonds that remind us of the love, loyalty, and resilience that make these stories unforgettable. Join us tomorrow for another heartwarming journey you won't want to miss.